Welcome everyone back. We were just in executive session, and we're back from executive session. I believe the next thing we're going to do is go to our public hearing. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes.
Sorry, I'm nodding.
So we're going to conduct a public hearing concerning the intent of the Board of Education to sell not to exceed 9.5 million working cash fund bonds for the purpose of increasing the district's working cash fund. Eric?
So actually, this is just an opportunity for the community to stand up and speak and voice your opinion to the board.
Can I stop for 1 second?
Please.
So now we're in the public meeting. I have to call the meeting to order first.
Yes.
And I'd like to call the meeting to order for verbal attendance of board members starting furthest to my left. Please state your name for the record.
Diane Stefani.
Michael Corman.
Scott Nelson.
Natalie Jektorowitz.
Jim Baumstark.
And John Heggie cannot be with us this evening.
And James Dolan.
Thank you. All right. Now, Eric, can we go back to you?
So this is actually the opportunity, like any hearing, just to allow the community to voice their thoughts or concerns to the board. The only thing that I would like to mention tonight, sort of to dovetail on Board Member Baumstark's comment last meeting, I believe, was that in the pre-referendum information that was shared with the community estimated the 4 bond issues to be repaid over a 23-year period with a conservative interest rate estimate and combined all-in true interest cost of 3.48% for a total debt service of $174,367,250. For the first 2 issues that the board did for the referendum-approved debt, with a repayment time period of 19 years with a combined all-in true interest cost of 1.46 and a total debt service of $137,256,785 for a total interest savings of $37,110,465. I just thought it'd be good to reiterate the savings from those first 2 issues.
And I also want to bring up that we're doing this in a different time frame also because we anticipate higher interest rates and we're trying to save money for the taxpayers.
That's right.
Are there any questions from the board for Eric right now?
Or from the community.
I gotta go through that.
Sorry.
Okay. This is first opportunity for audience comments. Are we gonna have any audience comments about the public hearing right now, Kathy? Do we have any? But anyone who wishes to address the board about the public hearing can submit a comment card, and this is your opportunity. All right, seeing that there are none, we'll move along. And then we just adjourn the public hearing, correct?
Yes.
All right. The public hearing is adjourned. We'll move back to our regular meeting, which is the C section of our agenda, which is the approvals. Can I get a motion and a second to approve the agenda?
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, the motion carries. Now, may I have an approval of the May 2022 regular and executive session minutes?
So moved, Corman.
Second, Stefani.
All those in favor?
Aye.
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 Any opposed? The motion carries. Now, before we move on to our next section, I'm sorry, I know we just came into the meeting and everything, but I want to give everyone here a chance to take a bathroom break really quick. We were meeting for quite a while in executive session, so we'll be back in 5 minutes.
Diane.
Still waiting on Diane.
Diane.
Sorry. Okay,
Did she leave?
yeah.
Oh.
So I just want to make a point here that Diane Stefani is not going to be here with the rest of the meeting. She had something she had to get to. So, thank you. Now we can move along to our communications section. Dr. Deli?
Yes, thank you. I wanted to just start with a quick recognition before we get into really two presentations. But Mary Garrity is joining us this evening for her last school board meeting. Mary, can you believe it? Where is the time gone? But she will transition into her retired life, and we're just thrilled for you, Mary, for a whole host of reasons. Anyone who knows Mary understands that she brings the full force of her expertise and her passion and her strong work ethic when she comes to work every day. We all know that about you, Mary. As a special services administrator, Mary has always advocated strongly for students with special needs and has advanced our best practices as a school district well beyond what I could have ever imagined. And Mary and I entered the district really at the same time. What's also remarkable about you, Mary, is you innately advocate for all students. You are so much more than the face of special services. You advocate for all children. You're often the very first person in the room to say, and by the way, this best practice is good for all children in the room, not just children who may have special needs. And you're such a strong advocate. And we're going to miss your wisdom and your wit and your humor and your energy and your kindness. And you've done so much for the district. It's hard to enumerate all those things. Those who have worked closely with you, like I have, know for sure, and others. But we all wish you the very best in all that retirement has to offer, and some great adventures with your beautiful son. So best wishes.
And when you see us on your phone calling up, you got to answer.
Block, no.
While there's service, right?
Do you have anything you want to say, Mary?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dane, for those kind words. It's been my honor and privilege to be here. It's been a great ride. Worked with the best people, truly. This is a great team. And I know with Kristen, it's going to carry on. Kristen and Natalie, zealous, it's going to carry on, and great things for the future. So I wish you all the best.
Thank you, Mary.
Thank you, Mary.
So we'll move on to our next presentation, and I'd like to welcome Dr. Kurt Schneider, Superintendent of True North Educational Cooperative. Welcome this evening, Kurt. For those listening who may not be aware, True North is a partner organization that assists District 34 with some of our special service related needs that we have for some children in our school district. And Dr. Schneider has been invited here this evening to share some of his expertise on inclusive educational practices in the true spirit of all means all, and you'll learn more about that with his help. You will see that both the theoretical and practical framework of his presentation is applicable to the increasingly diverse needs that our students in the school district have. And we have previously shared with you in other presentations data on our academic achievement gaps for students with certain demographics and a part of student demographic cohorts, and we'll continue to share that information with you. So we're trying to bridge a multifaceted approach to our inclusive practices. So with that introduction, Kurt, thank you, and
Great.
you have the floor.
No, I'm glad to be here. Thanks for the invitation. I too wanted to just thank Mary for her years of support, in terms of all of our meetings that we attend together. And she's been a strong advocate and a philosophical alignment with the work that we're doing. And so I just thank you for your support. And Natalie as well, she's been a school board member. She's our vice president. I think you're finishing year 5, if I remember right. And then Dane, too, your support this year, as a board member for us, too. So, we're all trying to partner and spearhead this work and support each other because there's no one system that can do it by itself. And so hopefully, what I share a little bit tonight might be helpful as you think about how to further enhance your strategic plan and the work that you're doing in the coming years. So I come to you as obviously a superintendent of True North. The name purposefully has changed, which represents the alignment of trying to talk about all learners, including students with disabilities, but also all student groups, not just necessarily students who may have years ago sort of been part of the cooperative in more traditional sense in Illinois. So, so under that guise, what I'm going to do is sort of walk you through a little bit of what's happening nationally, what's happening sort of within the state, and then also some recent regional data that we're spearheading as part of our renewal of our strategic plan that I think is relevant, so that as you guys have conversations here, you have a picture of sort of the 18 neighbors that are part of the cooperative that will be helpful so that you can see trends and also see what other people are doing in terms of successes and also areas that people are targeting for their improvement work. So I framed this in 4 parts. I think it's important to really understand the first, which is how did we even get to where we are in American schools, and what outcomes do we see for different types of student groups? Second, what are the structures that are needed to be able to move forward these student groups, and what's the research actually say? And then boards, we've spent a lot of time on mine talking about funding and policy requirements. And so how does that further align to this mission and vision of all learners? And then what specifically, what we're always asked is, well, what can we do as a school board, or what can I do as a school board member to support continued systemic improvement? And so just a quick fast forward of history. And this applies to whether students, you're talking about students with disabilities, whether you're talking about students who speak multiple languages, whether you're talking about students who, are not necessarily white, or students who are LGBTQ+. Sort of there's an evolution of time across student groups of students and families that may not necessarily have had the same educational experience as we may have seen sort of in the typical normative of how schools were built back in the day. And back in the day, schools were typically normed if you were white, if you were affluent, if you spoke English, sort of those larger norms, if you will. And if you were not part of sort of that profile, oftentimes what has happened, what you see on the left, is you are sort of outside of the circle. And so when we discovered as a country that we wanted to sort of recognize really all meaning all, the federal government got involved and we created regulations for different student groups that weren't even getting an education. So for example, students with disabilities were not necessarily even entitled to an education until 1975. And so folks who were part of those graduate programs are still alive and well in our schools. And they have walked this sort of path that you see on the screen, where they would have been part of school systems with kids and families that were outside of the school system, not getting an education, to now today, where there's federal legislation, there's funding that's attached to it, and we're trying to really include everyone to the best of our ability. So when you walk this path, what you'll see is that whether you're a student of color, so on and so forth, there's been an evolution, and each different learner, each different student group is sort of somewhere within this continuum. But the goal is to get to the right side of the screen, where you have a school district that just sees kids as kids, that you look at kids based on their passions and their assets and what they bring, and not necessarily on their label and the sort of the deficit skills that are often associated with different types of learners. And so when you understand sort of that history of how we've, in some cases consciously, but also in many cases unconsciously marginalized different families and different groups of learners, we wanted to just share with you what systems have seen nationally in terms of statistical outcomes. And there's 6 themes that when you have been largely marginalized or segregated or tracked, different experiences have happened to you. And so these 6 outcomes are broad themes that are spoken at various national conferences, and I just wanted to share them with you. That first and foremost, that when we have typically marginalized different types of learners, we've sorted, they may have gotten tracked, and that's been based upon their particular identification, whether it's by race, economic class, language, or ability. The second is what that has done to learners is students who often have the most complex needs, they end up sort of carrying a backpack with them because they've been asked to travel to the most number of environments, to work with the most number of teachers, they have to get to know all the paraprofessionals. So their school day actually becomes pretty fragmented. And so for kids who need actually the least fragmented day, they're actually sort of case managing the most adults and having the most fragmented day. So that's from the kid perspective. From the educator perspective, if you're the classroom teacher, no matter what grade, elementary, middle, or high, you have to know where those kids are when they're not with you, and what happens in terms of that curriculum, in terms of those assessments taken, in terms of the delivery of instruction. And for an educator, it's virtually impossible to keep track of that number of students across those many staff members and have adequate time to communicate, co-plan, co-serve all of those different types of students. Fourth, oftentimes we've spent a lot of time in meetings. When you add up the cost of a meeting and all the people attending that meeting, what results is we spend a lot of time deciding who gets help and who doesn't. And as a result of that, sometimes based upon the identification, that may come with a negative stigma that often might blame or label that particular student or that particular family. Fifth is that when those students are elsewhere, as I mentioned before, when they come back to the classroom kept going. It didn't stop and wait for all the kids who were receiving services elsewhere to come back home. The class kept moving forward. And so then that learner, not only are they having to manage all those adults and all those curricular areas and resources elsewhere, but when they come back to the class, what happens is they have to then sort of get back on that train and sort of catch up to where the rest of the class kept going. So if you're a learner with ADHD, or you're a learner who's struggling emotionally, or whatever your particular challenge is that day, you have added complexity to your day, which has a negative impact on your student achievement. And then finally, when you add up all of those sort of separate programs and all of that sort of isolated way of delivering services, from a board's perspective, when you add up those particular dollars and those costs, that type of delivery of instruction is the most expensive way to deliver services for the outcomes that are actually the least effective. So you spend a lot of time managing a complex system, spending a lot of money, and not necessarily getting the learning bang for your buck that we would have hoped or we would have thought back in when all these programs were initially developed. So what we see, just in terms of breaking it down, that was sort of nationally. What you see here regionally within sort of the collective cooperative area, so again, we're part of 18 districts, so everyone from sort of Lake Bluff, Lake Forest, down to Kenilworth, and then out here to Glenview and the Glenbrooks. What we've done is we've been tracking for the last 6 years. We've had a purposeful emphasis on trying to get learners with disabilities back into their home districts, in their home schools, in the classroom in which everybody else is a part of. And so we track and have looked at, what % of their day are they spending with their typical peers. And so you can see here there's a nice positive trend of 5 to 6 to now it's going to be 7 years, where incrementally all the systems are working to try to be much more inclusive in their delivery of service. When Dane referenced Mary's advocacy, this is what we've been all trying to do, which is a huge credit to the people who are out there trying to sort of intentionally interrupt their systems so that more learners can have more opportunity to participate in their home district, home school, general ed classroom that everybody else gets to experience. And so what you see here, how you read this particular chart, if you're just looking at 2021, 71.4% of students across the region who have an IEP are spending 80% or more of their day with their typical peers. And so that's the best sort of manner in which you can raise and close the gap when you look at students with disabilities. When you see these gaps between students with disabilities and their non-disabled peers, the best first step is to get them as much access to that core curriculum with everyone else as possible. And so this is a really good trend line. What you see in the blue at the top is that you start to see that students should be experiencing then less need to go somewhere else. So they should my enrollment on my end should be going down as more learners are back in their home districts. And so that you start to see incrementally going down, which makes sense from a high of say 9.5 in 2013 to now 5.3%. So that's again a good trend line. When you look at what happens between elementary and high schools in our particular region, you start to see there's a breakdown. So you're more likely to be included if you are in a K-8 system than if you are in a high school. So if you're a family and a student experiencing more of an inclusive schedule here at Glenview 34, it's statistically more likely that that will probably decrease as they move to the high school. And so that's common whether you're Lake Forest, whether that's New Trier, whether that's the Glenbrooks. And so there's a lot of work that we want to do as a system to partner, particularly at the secondary level, to be able to make sure that no matter where you are, your age, that shouldn't happen. You should have a continued growth in inclusive experiences, not a decrease. And so what you see here is just, for example, how you read it would be True North total, so that's taking all 18 districts. 6% of all 18 districts are educating students with an IEP in a separate facility. That matches that state average on the bottom of that chart. And so when you think then about the amount of dollars that are going into sort of educating kids elsewhere, the question should surface as to, with the amount of money our region is providing to support learners, to be at the state average should be something that we should say collectively, regionally, that's not acceptable. When you move over to the right side of this chart, you see the 80% or more in gen ed. You start to see that statistically, the elementaries are at 75% of all their learners who have an IEP in class with everyone else 80% of their day or more. You see that divide, then you see the high schools at 55%, which is slightly right where the state average is. So again, for the amount of learners that we have and the dollar amount attached to educating each learner, that dollar value is higher, much higher than what the state average is, but yet our outcomes are at where the state is at in terms of their access to inclusive environments. So that calls that question. So on our end as a cooperative, we're saying let's partner more strongly and strategically to figure out how to get these numbers up so that gap in learning for students who have disabilities closes and doesn't sort of stay the same over time. You see that same gap in terms of racial equity as well across the region. This chart was just developed for us from Hazard, Young, and Attia. So we've contracted with them to lead a strategic planning process across the region so that we can figure out the next level of work in the next 3 to 5 years. And so what you see across the 18 districts is that no matter if you're a student of color, whether you see a male-female gender gap, you can see that there's a lot of work to do to try to close these opportunity gaps and these achievement gaps. And that's consistent across all content areas. And so that's something that's, again, an opportunity for us regionally, but also in terms of what we'll need from board support moving forward as to if we're really going to address, racial equity, we're going to have to get into some conversations that are going to be challenging the typical normative that I talked about in the first opening slide. So when I was putting this presentation together, your staff have been highly engaged in this work for a long time. And so this is, some of the information that they shared with me that they wanted shared and conveyed to all of you. And so there's a lot of good work that is being done. A lot of your staff have been at a lot of our professional learning sessions. And part of what we're talking about are these gaps. And so you're not unlike anyone else. Your gaps might be larger or smaller depending on the student group that you're talking about, but collectively you're not alone. And so, but these are hard data points to move, and it takes time and it takes resources to be able to try to move them. So the goal, though, is if we're trying to collectively, whether it's nationally, statewide, or within the northern suburbs of Chicago, if we're trying to build an inclusive community, then the school system and what happens to the students and the families once they leave us have to be aligned. And what's happening in Illinois is typically once they leave K-8, they have more of a self-contained experience in the high school, and then when they leave the high school, the families will express to you that it's actually a cliff. And so there aren't any or very limited resources for students based upon diversity once they transition and graduate from the secondary system. So conversations with adult services along with the K-12 system need to occur so that we can make sure that from a student and family perspective there's continuity in their lives. So as I was reviewing your strategic plan, there's a lot of good in there, and I understand that you're going to continue to talk about how to make it even better. But what I think is important as an outsider, as I'm looking at it, that you should be commended for a lot what's in there that you don't necessarily see in other places. That you're purposefully calling out student groups, you're intentionally trying to align resources, you're hitting home that we need, one of the big keys is to have staff figure out how to strengthen their practice in their classrooms, which is what we would call differentiated instruction. And that we're really looking at data across different student groups and having conversations on how to best intervene to be able to address some of those gaps. So all of those commentaries you don't necessarily find in every strategic plan. You might read things that are kind of high level and kind of fluffy. And yours is very specific and much more laser-like. And so I just wanted to, as an outsider, just take a moment to commend you guys as a board and as an administrative team and as a community for that. Because what research says is if you don't call it out, it will never get addressed. And so the fact that you're doing that should be a celebration. So given all of that, what do we continue to need to do to be able to not accept those outcomes for different student groups? So first and foremost, John Hattie is a national researcher who has done a lot of work looking at the meta-analyses of all the different meta-analyses. So meaning what are the what is the collective research base saying from a quantitative perspective? And the number one thing to close a gap is that at the top of this chart you see the sort of fancy educator language called collective efficacy. It's basically saying when educators get a chance to collaborate, to talk about best practice and share what works is the best thing that you can do. So that value of where you see 1.57 means that if that's implemented, you will have more than a year's worth of growth in a year's worth of time. So everything above that perforated line is directly linked to trying to close those gaps. Everything that's below, we should think about, is that something that we want to do? If so, then we just need to know that we might use it sometimes, but if we consistently use it, then that means that we're probably not going to see a year's worth of growth in a year's worth of time. So as you're sort of fleshing out and trying to figure out how to enhance your strategic plan to address those issues, one place to go as a resource is to his work. Your team has done a lot to actually tackle that topic. So that whole collective efficacy, what you see here is you see on this slide and the next slide is basically the school year and what's happening at different points in time within your system. And so your team has done a really nice job mapping out what's happening in October, what's happening in November, what's happening in December, what's happening in January, February, what's happening at the central office level, what's the conversation between central office and each of the schools, How are each of the schools working with their principal? How are they looking and reviewing data? When they're not talking about it as a school, how are they talking about it at each grade level or each content department meeting? All of those things are active on these 2 slides. And so I think that's a huge credit to have mapped that out so that people can hold themselves accountable to making sure that we truly are talking and having statistical conversations. So I'm sure they will share more of what happens in more of a granular level, but just know that to implement that top item that we were talking about from John Hattie, you see that actually embedded here within your system. That collaboration is hugely important, and so not only is the quantitative information important, but the qualitative information as well. So making sure that the examples, what we're hearing from families at parent-teacher conferences, all of that is also data that needs to get triangulated to figure out, do we have everything in place that we need to? So that theme of collaboration, again, is important from a quantitative perspective, but also a qualitative perspective. When staff are needing to sort of have an opportunity to learn what else, and really dive into some of these conversations around certain groups that can be touchy. And you hear that now, in terms of, when you turn on the news, you hear talked about, critical race theory, you hear, all these different themes about disability, and you hear it around sexual orientation, and so on and so forth. Those are tough conversations to have. But what's happening and what you see mapped out here is from an equity perspective, there's concentrated learning that's being driven to the faculty level to be able to engage in a host of these topics from a place that's an asset-based, not a deficit-based. And so you can see it literally mapped out month by month, what's happening, and making sure that we're having conversations with correct fact-based information without emotion, that we're doing it in a way that's meant to be helpful to the student and the family, but that's not going to pit one student group against another student group. That truly is marrying what's best for everyone. So if you're a learner who's really advanced, no one's talking about taking anything away. What we're talking about is how do we collectively share the expertise that works so that every group continues to grow. So here's just to illustrate that point. It's very short, but it's 2 minutes just summarizing, if Kathy wouldn't mind playing it. So if you don't believe me, believe Jeannie Oakes.
And imprecise practice that we seem to have a great deal of confidence in as an efficient way to handle individual differences in learning settings. It turns out that there's very little evidence that that theory is effective in the way we practice it in schools. So for example, the first premise is that children are sufficiently different in the way they learn and what they're able to learn, and that we can diagnose those differences and then divide them into groups that are sufficiently similar so that we can target instruction precisely at the level of those kids. But when you look empirically at the characteristics of children in classrooms, children are extraordinarily diverse in all sorts of ways. And if you group them on one characteristic, you're going to have a huge amount of diversity and variation on other characteristics. So first of all, we fool ourselves into thinking that we've got homogeneous groups of students. So then when we target instruction, rather than thinking about always differentiating instruction to not even accommodate, that's too negative of a word, but to just recognize and acknowledge students' differences as being normal. Whenever we do that targeting, we are then limiting the possibilities for all of the children in the group. So it's not surprising that we get quite a lot of evidence that says unless you're in the group that everybody thinks are the very smartest kids, your learning opportunities and your outcomes are very much limited by that practice. So we have a practice that's very popular, very common, that's based on a flawed theory and for which there's almost no evidence of effectiveness.
So just to summarize, what she's essentially saying is in the sort of old way of school, we created, because we weren't necessarily strong at teaching to a wide range of learners, what we did is we set up schedules, master schedules in schools that often sort of sift and sorted learners. And if you were a student with a disability in this region, the more complex the disability, you sort of went to True North. If you are really advanced in a particular class, you might have gone and traveled somewhere to receive sort of advanced learning instruction. And so what we've learned as a profession is that actually doesn't necessarily get the bang for the buck as we would have thought. And so when teachers are much more taught collectively to sort of teach up, what happens is that all students benefit from that. So the advanced learner continues to meet their growth benchmarks, and students with disabilities who may not have ever had access to that level of rigor are now also performing at higher levels because they've had access to higher levels of cognitive thinking and exposure to content areas and skill areas that they may not necessarily have experienced. So everyone benefits, and so there's a disconnect because historically there's a bias from that normative that, oh, a student with a disability can't possibly benefit from a student who is advanced in a particular, let's just say, math class, that it's going to water down or sort of cheat a certain type of student group, when in fact that's not true. That's not statistically true.
Groupings.
If we can, there we go. So what your system and other systems are working on is trying to figure out, to truly address those gaps, how do we use our FTE in a way that sort of shrinks the classroom teacher's responsibility of trying to know where every learner is when they're not with them, and all the different curriculums across all the different grade levels in a particular system. And so you see much more here how groups are working to try to create teams. This is just a simple example of, say, there might be the kindergarten team that comes together. They may have all their paraprofessionals, they may have their different, EL teachers, they might have some of the other specialist teachers. Figure out as a group, how do we best sort of use our talents across learners in a particular week. You might now start to see the first and second grade staff become a team and take their resources and figure out when and best how to use them in a particular week. Or third grade or fourth and fifth grade combining. You might see at a high school or a secondary level, you might see that there's special ed staff who no longer have offices. They might be embedded within content areas. So a lot of different systems are trying to figure out how to team more collaboratively in the school day so that people are not necessarily having to travel to know all these different learners and all their different curriculars and all the different staff associated with it, because they're not able to necessarily do that effectively. And what that means here is in your multi-year plan across the next 4 years, you see those same research-based principles embedded in your administrative plans that are being developed here. So next year there's a strong focus on data literacy. In the following year, there's continued emphasis on differentiation within the classroom. You see that in the following year, collaboration continues to get strengthened, and the opportunity to have planning and shared planning across more and more educators. So those key principles are embedded within your plans here, which are directly linked to the research, which are directly linked towards raising student achievement and closing those learning gaps. One other that I just wanted to mention is there's a lot of conversation in the region around coaching. So from a best practice sort of perspective, it's less effective to sort of go to a learning session in a particular day and expect that the educator, when they come back from the conference or the day-long institute, is going to take what they learned and implement it. That's actually one of the lesser effective ways of continuing to grow your skill as an educator. What is more effective is that when you have an opportunity to work with a coach or somebody who might be a step ahead of you right within the classroom, to be able to directly show you, do it together, model, you try it, I try it, sort of rotation of that is much more of an effective way, that embedded way of coaching and delivering professional learning. You're seeing that increase across all the districts, and our role in that also to help people who are in coaching roles know how to even be a coach. And so they too need their own professional learning on how to actually even be a coach. And then lastly, how you put all these things together, which you see here in your system, but how does central office work with the schools? How do in the school, how do the grade level teams work with each other? How do we align the teacher and the administrative evaluations? How do we embed as much professional learning, as I just mentioned, as possible? That's going to require changing master schedules. That's going to require changing teachers' day, how they might team with each other. So all of that becomes in motion. And then what happens is that we have to make sure that our stakeholders, particularly our parents, are understanding that that's sort of the evolution of the system that's happening, because we were all raised in a system at a time that was tracked, that I didn't necessarily see students with an IEPs, and I'm from, Sheboygan North in Wisconsin, and the kids were in the basement when I went back and figured out, where students were. So we all grew up in a system that probably was much more segregated and much more siloed and tracked. And so when we have kids, it becomes, we're sort of like, oh, the school day doesn't look like it used to, when I was in school. And so we've got to onboard parents and community members to what we're doing so that they can be supportive of the shifts that the systems are trying to make. The last category is just funding and policy. I think it's helpful for boards to understand that this is not just research, this is also what's in federal law. So for all students, including students who have disabilities, ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act, requires these core elements, that the instruction has to be differentiated. They use language called universal design, same general principle, that we've got to be looking at all of our student groups. We've got to be having accountability checks. We've got to be reinvesting in different types of professional learning, looking at data, making sure that everyone's highly qualified. And if kids need something in addition, those interventions are in place. So everybody gets what's in blue. What students who have an IEP get in addition to what's in blue is that we got to make sure that anything can be individualized for them, that it's provided where everybody else is, and that if, in fact, we violate any of that, parents have a right to challenge the school system and are guaranteed procedural safeguards. And finally, that it's free and appropriate for them. So everyone's blue, and then if you have an IEP, then you get also what's in yellow. And so the notion here, the title of the slide is intentional, is that sort of it's old school thinking that there are learners who are sort of general ed students, and then there are learners who are special ed students. And that's a flag to say that that's sort of like a different era of time. Now it's all students are general ed students, and all students are general ed students first and foremost. And if you need something special or tailored to you, then that becomes part of a plan that gets documented. But we need to sort of change the language, because that whole special general gets into that labeling, which actually statistically, when you look at the research, has a negative impact on student achievement when we use deficit-based language. Again, just being really specific, special ed is instruction. Again, it's where everyone else is. It's at the school that everybody else gets to go to. And if you aren't, then there has to be some explanation for why they may not be. And so all of those pieces are at play if you have an IEP. And oftentimes we're asked, yeah, Kurt, that sounds great. However, and then they'll list a certain learner that they perceive to be really challenging the system. And they'll say, yeah, but what about that kid? Or what about that kid? And so when we looked at the research base of what about that kid, what's at bold here is that there's not a single research article ever written in 45, 50 years now that special ed has been born that found that a segregated way of teaching them is more effective than an integrated way, even if you have the most severe disability. And so that becomes, okay, so if that's true, then the question is why are students continuing to be, statistically placed in separate placements? Our region is twice as likely than the state average to send kids somewhere else. Not this particular district, but I'm talking collectively, regionally. you see that trend at a much higher rate than across the state average. When you look at English learners, just quickly, I know we're running out of time, it's that same thinking. So again, there's federal policy. That policy aligns to the special ed policy. It aligns to the ESSA. And so again, what this particular field is saying, basically get all the kids in the core instruction, give them the supports where all the other kids are at. That's going to require the staff to work in teams, and that's going to push on how people have traditionally probably delivered that service. So just know that the different subgroups of learners, policy related to them is aligned to be in this inclusive direction. So what we should be spending money on is less on a program and more on a service, because a service can go anywhere, and the student and the family shouldn't have to leave to go get help. The help should come into where the student and the families are. And so your system has been working aggressively to make that shift, which you're probably starting to experience different budgets, and they look and they're funded differently with different things in them in this effort to sort of make some of these transformational shifts. So as a school board, in closing, what can you do? So we would have, on our end, written an article in AASA recently. We spend a small amount of time, but in every board meeting, talking about these key concepts, so that when a different budget comes forward, or when we wanted to change the name, or when there's a different practice occurring at a particular school, that there's an understanding at the board table for why something different is coming forward, and that the system has confidence that it's been vetted. So oftentimes you might hear, like most recently for us, there was a lot of chatter around the budget. Well, it was in process, and it's making sure that groups have weighed in so that when we get to the actual approval stage, there's an understanding of that it's gone through sort of the wash, if you will, and ultimately it's aligned with these practices, because we want to be spending money on the things that are most likely to support districts in reducing the gap in learning, and so that's shifting a lot of the budgets across schools. So what can you individually do as a board? One thing that we found hugely successful is every time I'm at a conference, a board member goes with me. If we're taking a class, a board member is going with me, just to continue to be able to learn as a leadership team. That's been hugely effective, helping people understand sort of the history of different student groups and the roads they've traveled is really, really key. And to stay current in all these teaching practices, so when you hear these terms, you actually have a reference for what that actually means. The third is that, or the second is that as you're reviewing policies, I'm assuming there's probably some sort of committee or however you look at that, be thinking about obviously the different student groups in mind when you're looking at a particular policy, because it might be coming out from the state level as a resource, but you might have to tailor it to different student groups that you're trying to target and address. There's a lot that we can further support. So, we have a whole guidebook. We're trying to beef up on our end resources that will be helpful. You already pay for them, so maximize it. If there's learning sessions that have opportunities and have seats available for people to attend, get staff in there because it's meant to be aligned to all of this type of work that's going to help move your system and your achievement forward. And then just in closing, the last two, Glenn Singleton, who does a lot of work around courageous conversations around racial equity, talks about the importance at a leadership level to ask good questions, to be supportive in your inquiry, but really there's four sort of norms. One is to stay engaged, it's easy to check out. Two is those conversations are going to be uncomfortable depending on what you're trying to interrupt or what you're trying to shift, or an old practice that you're trying to evolve into something that's more modernized. That's going to cause different groups of people at different moments to have anxiety. And so that's normal. And know that that's just part of the change process. And that people, when you're experiencing that, to speak your truth about it so that we can have honest conversations and be able to figure out how to respond. And then lastly, to expect and accept non-closure. This is lifelong work. It's nothing that's going to, all go away in 3 years. It took, hundreds of years to create a system that, some would argue intentionally, some would argue, not intentionally, have sort of marginalized groups of kids. So we've got to, collectively work together, and it's going to take time. And then lastly, I would just, continue as you guys have done to really market your successes with your students, your family, and your community members, so that people know all of the good things that are happening here. And again, be proud of what is happening here. I haven't heard otherwise. I'm just saying be proud of it, because, what I've seen at a bird's eye view is something that I don't necessarily see in every system, and that should be commended. So thank you for your courageous leadership, you guys. It's hard to be a school board member right now, and we appreciate, as administrators, working collaboratively with all of you and partnering with you so that we can do really good things for kids and families.
Thank you. Does anybody have any questions for, is it Dr. Schneider?
Yeah.
Thank you. I wanted to get it right.
Doctor, you mentioned policies, and I just want to touch base. We use press.
Yeah, we do too.
Do you find that the press policies do a decent job of capturing the intent that you brought up on your slide?
Yeah, I think in our case, we have to tweak it further, and so there might be some adjustments, but I think by and large, it's been a great investment for the amount of money and the value that you get, so that you're not having to start from scratch. Systems that do that, I think, spend a disproportionate amount of time, and so it's better to work from something than a blank sheet. But what I would say is that when you're starting to, and we need to do a further stronger job as well, but really consciously be thinking of, okay, if you're a student who's black, if you're a student who has an IEP, if you're a student who speaks multiple languages, how does this policy play out for you? And that level of specific intention, we need to strengthen in our dialogue as we're reviewing them, that everybody is.
Do you have a feedback loop for getting that back to us to include it within our press system? And if not, would you be willing to consider that in working with
I think
Dr.
that'd be,
Nelly?
yeah, I think that'd be a great sort of value add if there's some sort of words of wisdom that we might have that we certainly could sort of push out, that you guys could entertain. I think that's a great suggestion.
Thank you.
Thanks. Anyone else?
Well, I just want to say, Dr. Schneider, it's good to see you at our table. I usually see you at your table.
Yeah.
And I've heard some of this before,
Right.
because of the 5 years that I've worked on the True North board. But I'm struck by something, as I always am, is that this is important work, but it's often daunting. It feels heavy or difficult or something that makes us feel a little anxious. And so you kind of want to think about there are challenges, and I appreciate all the positive things you've said about our district, and I'm not going to deny them, but I also won't deny that we can't just stay still. We have to keep developing. But what would you say is the biggest obstacles that districts like ours face in engaging in and trying to fight through that heaviness and that anxiety about this work? Or is that just going to have to be, and we have to accept that?
Great question. I think probably when I've been asked something similar, it's coming to grips with the history, and there's a level of emotion that will come with that. So if you're talking about racial equity, if you're talking about ability equity, if you're talking about whatever form, sexual orientation, there's those of us, like coming from my background, I didn't necessarily have a lot of experience on some of those topics. You don't want to say the wrong thing. You don't want to, push something forward that ends up being sort of wrong. And so that can be nerve-wracking, and it can create a level of anxiety. And what I've learned is that there's no way through it but through it. And so to really look at yourself, how many people do I interact with on a weekly basis who aren't white? Who am I interacting with in terms of better understanding, say, the immigration system? Or I have a responsibility to sort of get more knowledge and up to speed in areas that I didn't necessarily think about at the beginning part of my career. And so I think I would say that becomes sort of the critical piece, because then there's an understanding, because when you're trying to move these pieces, what often happens is there's a level of quick emotion. Some people will quickly respond and be like, yes, let's go. Some people are like terrified. Some people are going to be really angry. Some people are going to be like, tell me more. So you're going to have on any one of these topics any number of people who might be in one of those sort of quadrants. And so what I say to like the Leadership Council for me is like, expect that, know that that's part of the work. And if we can better understand the history and the stories of people, everybody comes to work every day wanting to do good things for kids and parents. Nobody's gone into this to do the opposite. And so if we can kind of understand each other and push through that emotion and get, if I say something inadvertently around, better understanding faith, that there's sort of an agreement that, it's not coming at it from a point of blame or trying to shame someone. It truly is coming from a place of trying to just be a better, knowledgeable person in an area that I might not have a lot of experience. So I think spending a good amount of time really understanding student groups and history and stories of that families are currently traveling is really important, because they just want to be heard, And then for the other learners, they want to know something's not going to be taken away, or that it's not going to sort of be shifted away from them. And when in fact what the conversation is about is really about everyone having growth, everyone trying to be included. Everyone should have somebody to have dinner with on Friday night. Everybody should feel part of their school. Everybody should be able to, walk with their neighbor if they're walking to school, if they so choose. Those are common across all of us, and we make this way too complicated when we add in a lot of vocabulary that's politically charged.
So can I just sum up? You're kind of saying if we're going to consider all of the students, we should consider all the voices out here, no matter how uncomfortable it gets.
Yep. Exactly. And how uncomfortable it makes us.
It's part of learning, right?
Yep, exactly.
Thank you. Does anybody else have any questions? Thank you, Dr. Schneider.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for joining us, Kurt. Appreciate it. Gives me something to do. Stretch. You need a minute, Kathy. Who's steering? You ready to go? Okay. Can we get into strategic plan now?
Yeah, let's
Sound
go
good?
into that.
Okay. So this is an annual review and update of our strategic plan. Remember that we do have a multi-year strategic plan. We still have a couple of more years of its life, but it won't be long before we really begin to retool that as we look forward. And it's information that we received not only tonight, but what we've assembled along this journey that will inform the future direction of our strategic plan. As I've said before, the last 2 years, we have been pretty squarely focused on the day-to-day operations of the school district during a pandemic. It doesn't mean, though, that we've lost sight of the fact that we have a strategic plan and that it's a good strategic plan and that it does provide us with the necessary guideposts that we need to really stay in touch with the big picture, because there's a lot more to operating a school district, obviously, than the day-to-day operations. There's where are you going and when do you plan on arriving and what have you learned along the way. So with that in mind, we'll talk a little bit about our strategic plan, and there's our mission statement. I mean, these things have not changed. This is, every opportunity we have to trumpet the mission of the school district, we do that. Aspire, Explore, Discover, Connect is some, you know, it's become sort of a chant, depending on whatever context you're in, which is, it may seem small, but it's really not. You know, people have coalesced around the importance of that. Go ahead, I'm sorry, Kathy. And much like we have said and what has been reinforced tonight, I'll never miss an opportunity to repeat this, but District 34 will be an inclusive, equitable school system that provides comprehensive, authentic learning experiences to develop the whole child. Our core values have not changed. That's really the engine that has gotten us through a lot of this work. They're uncompromising, they remain important, and they're listed there for you. So our first area to report back to you on briefly, student success and well-being. Dr. Silverman?
Yes, thank you. Well, this is awesome, right? We have added content for our children. We've added learning standards. We've increased their experiences. And this touch point for this strategy is so exciting. I mean, it's really a period of time. It doesn't happen often. We've expanded teaching and learning for children. And you can tell I'm super excited about this. We've talked a lot about STEM, the importance of STEM. Some would say it's critical for our children, for their learning, and for actually our community and our country. So that's super awesome. And modern media, you know, when we think through the lens of social media, messaging our children receive, creating their own content and messaging, these experiences have been exceptional. I have loved visiting these classes. Children are engaged in new ways, hands-on learning, the experience. This is just so awesome. And this strategy of opening doors, it has happened for real with our children. Our next step and our next stage is actually developing advanced coursework in these areas. The beauty and the challenge of the new middle school schedule is allowing children some choice, you know, over the 3 years. That's the key element. And children, if they find a passion or a love, or they've connected with something they've experienced on their first tier, or maybe the introduction to a STEM experience or modern media, we're slowly building out advanced courses for that, where they could take a second STEM class or a second modern media class, which again is really awesome. So that's our first strategy, and it's been great.
So strategy 2 has proven to be a very important strategy through the pandemic to ensure that articulation and programming is smooth, from not only the fact that we have grade centers within this district, K-2 buildings to 3 to 5 to 6 to 8, but as well as all of the transitions that we had throughout this pandemic. So for the 2022 school year, some of our highlights have been that we held in-person Family Connect nights, back in person through every K-5 clusters, and they were held at our 3-5 buildings. Our K-2s held kindergarten information nights for the very first time. We introduced fully our facilitated IEP processes, and all students that were transitioning to a new building had transition IEP meetings with their receiving buildings. For the first time this year, our interventionists held articulation meetings so that we could ensure continuity of services. Our MTSS coordinator, who's here this evening, is working to have consistent teaming structures and processes across all grade level bands, and our middle school success class has began this year to support 6th grade transition. And Kristen's going to talk about the look ahead.
Yep, so as we look ahead for strategy 2, we're excited that we've already started the process of adding on a module to our Power School for better data analytics, so that we could have meaningful data at our fingertips and use our time in planning, programming, and instruction. We plan on sending out satisfaction surveys to our families for feedback on how transition has gone for them. We've begun the development of an SEL library of lessons, explicit lessons for skill groups to help kids transition during the middle school years, which are often very difficult years for them. We've continued articulating with aligning academics throughout through the 5th to the 6th grade level, and we're very excited that we've added a layer on with our partnership with Youth Services, where in 5th grade we'll begin starting transition activities for kids that meet the criteria, English language learners, as they transition from 5th to 6th.
So our next strategy really touches so much about Dr. Schneider's presentation tonight, meeting the needs of all of our children, using our strategies, our teaching and learning capacity, and research to differentiate instruction. Our particular strategy in this goal area had 2 parts. Unfortunately, the pandemic had an impact on how we typically would administer, facilitate, and analyze our general outcome measures like Ames-Webb, NWA MAP, even IAR was impacted. So we'll report back, come back to that particular element. The first piece, though, our staff is becoming incredibly skilled on using data, and when I say data, most times our teachers and our staff will think about their classroom data because it's closest to our children, and it's the quickest way for teachers then to adapt, modify, or differentiate their instruction. And so we are running through that process, and it's integrated. It's multi-layered over years as we talk about more collaboration time, more time for teams to come together. This opportunity to better connect our MTSS system, Tier 1, our general education experience for our children, and then Tier 2 and Tier 3. And so creating this stronger connection between those 3 service levels for our children is something that even as a strategic plan might come to its resting point, this strategy will, I think, continue for eternity, quite honestly, because we're always going to be striving to meet the needs of all of our children.
So strategy 4 is a very important strategy as it focuses on building a foundation for our earliest learners. And so in strategy 4, our first part of strategy 4 is the goal, or the strategy is by 23-24 school year, having 80% of our 2nd graders meeting academic learning standards. And so you can see that at the end of this school year, our 2nd graders across each of our schools and their oral reading fluencies, 94% of our 2nd graders were at or above the 25th percentile. So average is considered 25th to 75th percentile. On their math benchmark, 94.1 were at or above the 25th percentile. When we looked at our 2nd graders in terms of social emotional learning standards as measured by engagement and emotional regulation, in engagement, we took a mean of our 2nd graders across those clusters. 87% had favorable responses, and emotional regulation, 86% had favorable responses. So this is definitely something to celebrate for the 21-22 school year.
Definitely, and as we look ahead for strategy 4, we just continue to build our responsive system by increasing parent education to support early learning. We're going to continue to analyze data in a meaningful way to link it to instructional planning for our kids, and we're going to continue to build robust SEL supports as part of a bigger system.
So I'll be speaking to the first strategy around educator growth and support. Strategy 5 is really largely focused around climate and culture, and the return to much more in-person activity with staff this year has really helped, re-energize this goal and this strategy. We were thrilled to return to in-person new educator orientation. That really is the opportunity with our newest staff members to emphasize themes that we've talked about tonight and bring people on board in a way that matches the cultural expectations that we have in District 34 and establish those right from the start. We hosted our first in-person District 34 retirement and recognition event in 3 years. That was a wonderful way to celebrate and show respect and gratitude for all that our staff put into this work. We launched a superintendent's advisory committee to really hone in on ways that we could continue to both support and attract additional diverse staff members. And then a look ahead beyond 2022 would be to continue, based on the feedback that we receive every year through our new educator orientation, through our mentoring, through role-specific professional development, really continue to differentiate that for people by role in increasingly effective ways. And then we're going to be piloting a concept of an affinity group for our District 34 educators of color to continue to explore ways that we can better support those staff members and increase the strength of our internal network. And then strategy 6, largely focused around professional growth and learning. Despite needing to sort of change and reallocate a lot of the Wednesday morning time for other professional activities, we maintained a focus on the need to really get our staff prepared for the learning spaces launch that will happen 22-23, so we maintained a focus on that through those Wednesday morning sessions for the key groups that most needed that at this time. The efforts that have come through Matt's department around level-specific literacy PD have been essential and vital, and those continue throughout the 2022 school year, and were really a highlight of this professional growth strategy. And we had a sort of return to a more robust mentoring effort. It's very hard to mentor in a virtual environment, which was the case last school year. And this year we had 54 new certified staff members receive individual, very targeted and specific skillful mentoring training for the mentors, just kind of re-energized and a recommitment to our efforts that were launched a few years ago around professional mentoring. A look ahead, we will have our first ever full day Kindergarten Institute in August to really, again, do what we do at New Educator Orientation, but in a much more focused way for our full day kindergarten teachers, both new to District 34 and inclusive of some of our veteran full day kindergarten teachers. They will all be part of it for varying amounts of the Institute. We will resume our full and robust weekly Wednesday morning PD schedule for the entire school year, which the board has seen in previous meetings. And the September 22 Institute Day is a massive expansion, I would say, of what staff have been offered by way of differentiation for their specific roles and their needs, as well as the folks who will be presenting, as much of that will come from internal expertise and interest as well as external. So those are exciting developments to look ahead.
So strategy 7 speaks to innovation, and while throughout the pandemic we experienced a lot of difficulties with different areas, one of them was not innovation. Teachers were instantly put on into a situation where innovation was, the speed of it was moved incredibly fast, which as we get through this, it really is an opportunity for us to capitalize on all of the opportunities that teachers were able to do during the pandemic when they were at home, when they were at school and coming back. And so this is an opportunity, along with our new media classes that Matt spoke to in STEM, as well as our soft starts that were provided K-8. I think it's also important to speak to the relationship that we've had with the GEF as it relates to each of these items, both soft start and our STEM, our maker modules that are now K-8 across the district, that provide opportunities for staff and students to work on projects together around areas of interest. And then one thing that we're really excited for coming this fall is that at our September Institute Day, we have a track of solely focused around innovation in instruction, innovation in learning, and how those blend together, especially with our new learning spaces moving forward.
And as we saw the first year of the pandemic, when we updated you on the strategic plan last year, the area of parent and community partnerships and the engagement, the pandemic actually offered some opportunities for us to connect with parents in different ways and be a little more flexible and innovative in how we engage parents in the community. Strategy 8, providing parents with the tools, resources, and consistent information, to support their kids' progress. The growth of the Glenview Necessities Network, GNN, brings together the whole community. This is something that Karen Hitzman kind of spearheaded, and it brought together District 34, District 225, youth services, and the village to provide a network to support parents and families in need. We increased our D34 Parent Connect programming. Those Family Connect nights were something that is going to continue into the future because families were so engaged in being able to reconnect with the community. And we've had community resource events at Sunset Village and at Glen Grove, and that kind of led to a look ahead. We are going to have a Community Connect resource fair for all of our families to launch our back to school, to make sure that families are connected with the resources that they need to support their students throughout the school year. And strategy 9, ensuring clear and accurate communication so community members can connect with what's happening within District 34 schools. We'll be continuing consistent communication through SMORE with teachers and teams, buildings, and district. So those communications are all connected, clear and consistent. We increased our website updates so that we have improved accessibility. Our website is ADA compliant. It provides translation tools. So we're continuing to build out our website, and we've done a great job of that this year. We launched a curriculum webpage that allows better transparency and connection so parents and community can understand our curriculum. And with the launch of full-day kindergarten, we knew that that was important this year to ensure that community members, especially those coming into District 34, knew about the launch of full-day kindergarten and our new spaces for full-day kindergarten. So looking ahead, we will have a parent survey to gauge communication satisfaction and needs, and we hope to launch D34 on Instagram, another way to share the great things happening in our schools with the community. And you can see some of the things that we've done. Our full-day kindergarten website and the curriculum website are easily accessible and out there for everyone to see. No, there we go. And, oops, sorry, didn't want to play that. These are just available to see. Increasing the partnerships to provide students with the authentic learning experiences. Brian talked a little bit about that, but we've seen some examples of, with the Springman Service Fair, partnering with the community to provide those authentic opportunities. We created a volunteer pool registration, and looking ahead, we're going to look for ways to promote that volunteer pool among the community to get more people signed up, and among staff to get them to use those resources that we have in our community.
And when it comes to the resource stewardship section, we're looking at strategies 11 and 12. Strategy 11 is address the aging facilities, deferred maintenance, make sure we have well-maintained facilities. And that's evidenced this year by the near completion of our full-day kindergarten additions and Springman new gym, which should be ready for August. And then in the summer, it's our typical maintenance and cleaning. And then as we look ahead, we're looking to future phases and all the good construction work that we've been discussing for the last several years. When it comes to strategy 12, equitably and responsibly allocate resources of time, space, and scheduling to enhance programming and instructional practices. That's evidenced by sort of the completion of our FY22 budget, look ahead to FY23's tentative and soon to be final, and then obviously looking ahead, trying to fold that budget into our long-range financial projections as we look to develop future budgets.
And then finally, just a comment on, as we approach year 4, we are going to take everything that we've learned over the course of this past school year, as well as previous years, as we formulate a pathway for next year. And so we spend very concerted time and energy at our administrative retreat over the summer, where a lot of that work gets done, as we formulate more specific goals and objectives as we enter into a new school year. So that's where we're at with that. We're happy to entertain questions that you may have.
I have a small question. When Kathy was speaking on the slide, it said award-winning FDK in 34. Was I sleeping? What was the award that got? I must have missed that some.
Last week, the National School Public Relations Association awarded a campaign for our full day kindergarten program
Well, kudos to you, Kathy. I know that's.
Any other questions? Mike?
So just broadly, I saw, I think, a couple of different areas where parents were going to be surveyed, but I didn't see anything, and I'm sure it's embedded, where staff are surveyed in terms of these changes related to middle school schedules and that sort of thing. I just want to make sure that that's on the record, that that's something I think the board would be interested in, at least me personally, but I suspect, knowing my colleagues, that staff input is important to that as well. Thank you.
Thanks. James, did you? No?
So I've got just one or two questions. First, it's a lot, which is awesome, right? Like, to say that we've done all these things as our first year back in school, kudos to everybody. One of the things, and this is a little bit of a thematic question, so whether it's, with pushing the STEM and modern media and like developing advanced programming at the middle school level, similarly with some of our analytics, or getting into some of the other programs, how connected are they to then facilitate that transition to the high school? Like, are we going to outpace the high school preparedness, and do we have that bridging on-ramp similarly to like the elementary school to middle school to high school as part of the programming?
So with the STEM program, it's, it's the same program in the sense that we build and then they take it from there. It's, we actually have the foundation, which prior to us starting our STEM program, our students were going into the high school with some exposure, but not the official exposure that they currently have. So there isn't any outpacing as it relates to STEM. Modern media is a new opportunity, and so for us, it's an opportunity for discovery and innovation of those students. And so we're going to see where that goes. It doesn't have a direct, I don't think, class that they go into when they go to the high school here. It's just opportunities for them as they move forward. Matt, did you have anything else?
I know, so we've articulated with the high school around these content areas, and one example with modern media that I think is a hidden gem I learned is the radio station at the high school. And again, as children find passion towards broadcasting, that type of media, we're just giving them a middle school experience and then kind of seeing where that leads for them. And so I think there's a robust set of experiences and opportunities to continue. The curriculum Brian was referencing is Project Lead the Way, and actually Glenbrook South is a national leader in Project Lead the Way curriculum, which is an international curriculum. So they have amazing growth ahead of them.
And I think I was probably specifically talking about like the modern media, because our students were going in with 0, and now they're going to be going in with stuff. And so if you only had 4 years of programming and you're coming in with 2 years already, or 3, are you going to tap out? And I think that's one of the, I would say, the challenges that we face, which is a great one, is to what extent can we be preparing students for going in such that they can actually reach that potential in high school that they wouldn't have otherwise achieved. So kudos to you guys, and keep, just encouraging to keep close on that, and also keep us apprised, because it's really
and I know you
fantastic.
saw during the GF conversation that we had up at Inatia's LRC, we currently are fortunate where we have more resources than we have experiences, meaning the kids have access to so much that we are now, with that class, modern media, and with other opportunities, STEM, the maker modules, are trying to then develop and find interests so that kids can develop those, and then we'll work with the high school on what that leads to. Like, does it lead to another opportunity for them, similar to them starting STEM and then us creating a lower program? Us having the modern media may influence opportunities that they'll have up there, or refine programs that they currently have because our kids are coming in a little more prepared.
Thanks. Anybody else? I'm looking forward to the Instagram account. I'll be honest with you, the Twitter account's awesome. I really get to keep up with what's going on in the buildings. And secondly, I'm really excited to see that the strategic plan didn't go by the wayside during a pandemic, and everyone's been focused on that. So thanks to all the staff and for all the hard work.
Can I just add to that for just a second? While Dane, you kind of humbly said, you know, you've been focused on day-to-day operations. From my perspective, your day-to-day operation decisions were made with our vision, our mission, and our strategic plan in mind when you were making those decisions. So I think that should be pointed out.
Thank you.
Thanks. Great. Dr. Daly, anything else?
No, that's our presentation for you. Thank you.
All right. That's the communication section. Sorry, it was a little longer, but very informative. Next, we'll move to audience comments. This is the first opportunity in this meeting for audience comments. Anyone wishing to address the board can submit a comment card available at the check-in table. Do we have any comment cards? All right, so this is our opportunity here. We'll move it to the next section. There'll be another opportunity for audience comments later. Next, we'll move to consideration of resolutions. This will be, I do all together, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a consent. We already talked about these before. This is number 1, 22048, the personnel report. Number 2, 22049, the payroll warrants. Number 3, the 22050 vendor warrants. Number 4, the 22051, FY 2023 tentative budget and call for public hearing. Number 5, 22052, administration and exempt salaries. Number 6, 22053, prevailing rate of wage. Number 7, 22054, interfund transfers. And number 8, annual certificate of hazardous conditions. May I have a motion and a second for approval?
So moved, Jack Torowitz.
Seconded, Corman.
May I have a roll call vote?
Dolan,
Aye.
Corman,
Aye.
Nelson,
Aye.
Jack Torowitz,
Aye.
Baumstark.
Aye.
Motion's carried. And now we'll move to the consideration of other resolutions. First, we have the 22056 Illinois Elementary School Association, IEAS Cooperative Team Agreement.
Thank you. So just quickly, the last time District 34 entered into this agreement was the year prior to when the pandemic broke, and that was the last time and the first time we were a part of this district cooperative. You can see based on the agreement that the schools of Northfield Township, except for the high school, the elementary districts of Northfield Township, have created essentially a wrestling team to compete. Individually, each school, including ours, would not have enough students on each district's behalf to actually compete as a team. So this is a consolidated effort. It gives children an opportunity to participate in wrestling and be part of a designated team. Think about it as a township team. We've been away from it for 2 years. We'd like to get re-engaged in this. We don't actually have a real good sense for what the student interest will be, but we think it's worth a try. The principals are very interested in promoting this. Another opportunity for students to get engaged in an extracurricular activity, so we'd like to be a part of this group.
Any questions? Could I get a motion and a second to approve a resolution as presented?
So moved. Dolan?
Second. Baumstark?
Kenny, may I have a roll call vote, please?
Corman,
Aye.
Dolan,
Aye.
Nelson,
Aye.
Jack Torowitz,
Aye.
Baumstark.
Aye.
Motion carries. And now we'll move to 22057, board policy regarding kindergarten.
Thank you. This is just a simple update that our previous board policy had not been changed to reflect full day, and so it's we need to have what we do reflected in the policy, and so this is just a simple change to reflect that.
Does anyone have any questions? May I have a motion and a second to approve the resolution as presented?
So moved. Corman?
Second, Dolan.
May I have a roll call vote?
Baumstark?
Aye.
Jack Torowitz?
Aye.
Nelson?
Aye.
Corman?
Aye.
Dolan?
Aye.
Motion carries. Now we'll move along to a discussion section. This is the Press Issue 109 first read.
Yeah, so just by way of reminder, the process that we use is to utilize the press service. It comes to us. It's really divided up by departmental area at the district office level, and we review the recommendations from the press service. There are opportunities at times where we can make choices about how certain phrases are laid out within the policy. We make the appropriate choices based on how they're portrayed in the policy, and they come to you. Nothing different procedurally. This is the first read of the policies.
And a lot of these are five-year review policies.
They are.
Are there any questions for this right now?
One question.
Yeah, Mike.
Dr. Deli, I know that we've looked at these at various times. Sometimes they change so subtly that we don't necessarily catch every aspect of the change and implement it. I just want to make sure as the team is going through these that they do take a really critical eye towards, especially reporting requirements, wherever they may be reported, so that we are in alignment, or if we wish to change those, that we change those appropriately.
Right, absolutely. And we spend equal time trying our best to make sure that our administrative procedures are aligned with those policies as well, which is the trigger to execute these policies. But point well taken.
Thank you.
Thanks. And this will be on our consent agenda next week?
Yes.
Next month?
Yes.
Okay. And we'll move along to audience.
Just a quick question on that.
Yeah.
So on the ones where there are choices in there, I noticed the drafts we haven't selected a choice. Like, is that something we're gonna need to discuss and choose as a board? In the ones, or will the final recommendations have the choices
Well, we make the choices, and then they're reflected before you vote to approve them. Are they not? Are there some that?
Many of
that are
them
not?
just say, like, choose one of the following, and it's not selected yet in these drafts.
Okay, well.
So I wasn't sure if that meant we needed to decide here, or.
By the time you act on these, you'll know which selection has been made. Are there any that are, I'm going to pull it up.
Can you point to
now,
one, Jim?
'cause
Policies with questions will have answers by the next review period. That's, I think, what you're referring to.
Yeah, like
Jim.
in 230, where it's public participation at board meetings,
Right.
it says, do you want to establish a maximum time limit for public participation? No.
Got it. I see what you're saying.
Yes, maximum of 60 minutes, or yes, something other than 60 minutes.
Right,
It's
that'll
just an
be
open-ended.
populated by the time
Okay.
you act to approve.
Well, I guess that brings up a secondary question, which is, will we see what was stricken so that we'll understand the nuance?
Yes.
Okay.
Thanks, Jim. Thank you, Mike.
I mean, these are color coded, right? I mean, the way to just make the red stuff is struck, and the
Correct.
green stuff is new.
Correct.
Except for the ones where it says completely redone. I think one or two of them was like a complete rewrite.
Right.
You just have to remember that that's all new.
And some are based
Some
on
are.
new laws that are written.
And some are just like 5-year review, nothing changed.
Right.
It just says you have to look at it every 5 years.
Yeah.
Right?
Or footnotes, or, yeah, it ranges.
Different case law it's referenced to. All right, thanks. We'll address that at our next meeting. This brings us to our second opportunity for audience comments. Do we have any audience comments? So this would be our second opportunity. We'll have this like we do every time we have a meeting. All right. Next, we'll move to our report section. We have the number 1 FOIA report, number 2 True North Board meeting report, number 3 Phase 1 construction change order report, number 4 monthly budget report, number 5 current year financial projections, number 6 referendum expense report, number 7 the process for half-day kindergarten, and number 8 the following meeting agenda. Are there any questions on those reports? No? All right. We'll move to other business. Does anyone have any other business? If not, we'll move to adjournment. Thank you for everyone coming tonight.
Thank you
And
all.
watching on YouTube.
Thank you.